Okay, welcome everybody to the second of our priorities for the Climate Commission for further and higher education. This priority is focusing on research and innovation. We are recording this session and I will mute everybody to begin with whilst we have the questions, and you can either unmute yourself or use the chat box to ask any questions throughout. Okay, I shall hand over to Jim, who is chairing this meeting.
Okay, thank you, Fiona. Well, welcome everybody to this, our second evidence gathering session of the Climate Commission. The Commission is, I think, possibly one of those things you can call unique, bringing together UUK, Guild HE, the Association of Colleges, and the EAUC, bringing us together to ask questions with students about the role, the energy, the commitment, the direction of travel, the rate of travel of the combined FE and HE sector in addressing the climate emergency. What we have is a series of evidence gathering sessions in which invited experts share views with us on key issues. And as Fiona has said today, we are in the second of those evidence gathering sessions, focusing on research and innovation, and specifically the funding and scope and the impact thereof of the research and innovation activity of higher education, but also acknowledging the important KE work of the FE sector. So without any further ado, I do want to take the opportunity to introduce first my co-chair, Ian Patton. So Ian, just say hi.
Afternoon, everyone. Good to be here. Thanks, Jim.
And I'm delighted that we have a student commissioner with us, Marta from the Grantham Institute at the University of Sheffield. Marta, do you want to just say hi?
Yeah, hello everyone. I don't have a video because I have a really bad network, but I will see you all.
Right. Great that we have a student commissioner with us, and student view and voice is critically important to the work of this commission. We're delighted to have not 4 as originally advertised, but 5 speakers joining us to provide evidence. Can I just ask them in turn just to say hi? Firstly, Alyssa from the Grantham Institute at Imperial College. It's a wave from Alyssa, that will do, thank you. Rob, I can see you on my screen at the moment. Rob, say hi. Rob, and introduce yourself.
Yep, hi everybody. Rob Gillies, Associate Director for UK Environmental Sustainability from UKRI.
Thank you, Rob. Vanessa, unmute.
Hello, I'm a policy analyst at the Russell Group.
Thank you, Vanessa. And you're also joined by a colleague, Joanna Burton.
Hello, yes, I'm Joanna Burton, also from the Russell Group.
So Vanessa and Joanna, you're going to do a double act when it comes to our questions. And finally, but by no means least, Emma. Hello, Emma. How are you?
Hi, everybody. Hello, I'm good, thank you. Hope you're all well.
Emma is Chief Exec of Society for the Environment and bringing the professional body perspective into these conversations. So what we are about today is understanding some of the scope, capacity and direction of the research and innovation activity of the UK. Before we get into how we're going to run this, I just want to set the scene a little bit so that you understand the scale and complexity of the sector that this combination of FE and HE actually brings to bear. A few statistics. We're actually talking about 164 higher education institutions, around 257 colleges of further education. Together, there are 4.5 million students studying in those institutions. There are somewhere in the region of 545,000 members of staff in those institutions. When you add all of that together, that's 5% or thereabouts. Sorry, I beg your pardon. That's 7% plus, nearly 8% of the UK population that is in some way involved in the FE and HE sector. A very significant size with potential for doing dramatic and positive things in a climate emergency. And if we just think about the expenditure of those institutions, by a quick view of the Association of Colleges website and the UUK website, it can be calculated that somewhere around £43.7 billion per annum is the annual expenditure of that combined sector, a very significant resource indeed. And if we just think for one moment about the population of graduates from HE, there are around about 770,000 new graduates who exit the UK higher education system. Now, if we think about the 2030 deadline that many institutions and many local authorities and other entities have set as their carbon neutral target, we think to 2030, that's around about 7.5 million graduates who have entered the workforce, become citizens of the UK or their home country if they're an international student, who, if we as a set of higher and further education institutions can provide not just the skills and knowledge, but the attributes and capabilities for addressing the climate emergency. Just think what capacity and capability that brings to us. So that's a little bit of scene setting. We have a tremendous opportunity to help catalyse action that is very positive. And just to bring us to the research agenda, quick view of the Research England website and the UKRI website just reminded me of the research investment that is made each year in the UK space. Research England provides something of the order of 1.7 billion and UKRI around about 7 billion in terms of their research budget. So we have a very significant research investment that comes out of those two entities into the sector. And of course, if we look at the productivity in high quality research outcomes in the peer review literature, the UK is acknowledged as one of the highest performing nations in the world in terms of the quality of research outputs. In science, it's acknowledged we're at least number 4 and possibly higher in terms of the quality of research output in published literature. So whichever way you cut that, there is a tremendous contribution that this sector can and is and must continue to make to addressing the climate emergency. I'm going to pause there, just get my breath back before explaining how we are going to run this evidence gathering session. So what we will do is that there are 4 specific questions that the commissioners have identified. What I'm going to do is ask each in turn of each of our evidence providers. I'm going to ask them to spend about a minute or so reflecting on that question, and then I'll come to the next in our list of speakers. I'll take them in the order that I started, which was Alyssa, then Rob, then Vanessa for the first 2, then Joanna for the second 2 of the questions, and then Emma. I would ask them to be as precise and succinct as they can be. We will be taking notes and we will be recording. Fiona has that part of the task underway. What we will do after we have heard each question answered in turn, we will see whether there are any further questions that Ian, Marta, or possibly I wish to ask. Then we will move on to our second and repeat, move on to our third, etc., etc. When we have completed that part of the process, I will then hand back to Ian, who will help us to coordinate any wider conversation that colleagues wish to enter into. And just in case you hear any funny noises before I mute later on, I've just been joined by a cat who's renowned for making a lot of noise. So I'll just say hi. This cat's called Bags. He's now obviously critical to the evidence gathering process. Okay, so enough of my cat. Is everybody happy with the way we're going to proceed? Speakers particularly, you're nodding. Can't see Rob, he's gone off. He's back. Rob, you're okay. Emma, you're okay. Then let's proceed. Our first question, I'm going to be very formal and I'm going to now read the question. Does the coordination of climate research in UK universities need to be enhanced to make best use of investments and drive impact? If so, how might this be done? So Alyssa, starting with you.
Okay, great. Yeah, thanks for the question. I didn't give this a straight yes or no, actually. I just thought I wanted to reflect a little bit on where I think things are going well at the moment, actually, and then where we could maybe think about some better coordination. So first of all, what I would say is I'm not convinced that we should treat climate research differently from other types of research, unless we think that all types of research need to be changed. And in the UK, we do take a kind of partly competitive, partly coordinated approach to research that uses some of that competition to drive the best science. And so that's the delicate balance between thinking about more coordination. And I think that would have to be treated at a wider level if we thought that we needed to dull down the competition and ramp up maybe the coordination or collaboration. So that's one thought. I would emphasize that climate research is really broad. So we want to be thinking about everything ranging from the physical climate sciences through to research on impacts and adaptation, things about the social sciences, as well as things related to just transition or behavioral sciences. We've got sort of interesting areas in philosophy and also history that can teach us about what we do about climate change. So it's a really, really broad area as well, which also means that it's not always necessary to coordinate everything because actually it's so broad. So that's another sort of thought there. I would also say that I think UKRI, and Rob's coming after me, but I do think UKRI is doing a relatively good job of this. We've seen quite a few good examples recently of large scale calls, the ESRC centers recently. There's been a NERC call on climate finance that's linked to innovation recently, that's already open at the moment. And I know from my experience of being on the NERC Strategic Program Advisory Group and now the advisory network, that NERC tries really hard, at least as one of the research councils, when they identify a research opportunity for a call, to make sure they bring other councils on board to broaden it and enhance that cooperation, at least at the funding stage. So I think that's going quite well. Areas where I think that there are opportunities, as I said before, this is a very interdisciplinary area. So pushing the interdisciplinary boundaries more could be good. I think, again, just funding the right kind of research that takes the right shape. So whether it's these little centers or these big centers or something linked to innovation is quite challenging. EPSRC has taken an approach of funding a big £20 million center on decarbonization of industry, which is a really interesting approach because that then brings in all of the different members of the research community and industry partners with one focus really, and one common goal. So I think that could be an interesting structure. So there's lots of different ways to get it right. I think one of the things that a weakness in the current system is sometimes there's quite a long time lag in perfecting these bids. And this is an urgent issue. So we could maybe do something better on quick and rapid fire calls or speeding up that process of identifying the right research calls. And I think there's a real opportunity, some of which is taken already, but to use the academies or the learned societies like the Royal Meteorological Society, the Royal Society, the British Academy, to help people communicate and coordinate their research where they have competed in one different subject, different topics or different research. That's a really good forum, which is also used quite well already. Some of this happens already. And then just finally, I'd finish on the innovation dimension of this question. I think innovation is different from research. We've got quite a few good catapults in the UK and frameworks for innovation. I know at Imperial, we've been running a climate change accelerator for some time, and we've also been actively teaching entrepreneurship. I think there's probably more opportunity for collaboration on what happens at the individual university level on that stage that is important. And often relationships with industry is key to get that innovation part right. Universities probably compete for these relationships. So maybe there's some different model that we could use there where we know we need to accelerate the moving ideas through to commercial success to tackle climate change. And there might be a different model there. So those are my thoughts and I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Alyssa. Rob, I'll come to you next.
Thanks very much, Jim. Yeah, I'll pick up on a few points that Alyssa's made. I suspect we'll all be sort of building on each other's contributions as we go through. I think in terms of the initial question, in terms of coordination, I would say yes, but agree with Alyssa in terms of the challenge for me in terms of that coordination issue is yes, coordinating, but also, you know, we do need to maintain the ability to kind of satisfy the discrete and varied objectives of the various funding streams and various calls that have legitimate objectives in and of themselves. And I think so that's a challenge. How do we maintain that the satisfaction of those individual calls and objectives for calls, and whilst at the same time looking at coordination. I think climate research is an interesting label. So I'd make the observation that obviously there is sort of direct, fairly obvious and direct and explicit research around climate change, but there is also, I think, as the point Alyssa was making, there's also an awful lot of relevant research that's just kind of tangentially related. And I think one of the issues is in identifying that additional research that maybe isn't labelled climate front and centre, but is absolutely central to addressing the problem. And again, as you mentioned, some of those issues, particularly around sort of behavioural side and economics and sort of business school contributions around business models and things like that. I think there's a question as to kind of by what object or entity could the coordination, or is the coordination best delivered? The organisations represented in terms of the Climate Commission, you know, obviously play their part. I think UKRI has a role here, and certainly in terms of the new environmental sustainability strategy that I've been brought into post to work on. There is a key and fundamental part of that is about how can UKRI use its influence, both its direct influence in terms of how it applies its budget for funding, but also kind of a more sort of soft influence around its role both within the UK and more globally. And I suspect there are probably other entities in policy space, government space, who actually I think would be crying out for a kind of single voice through which they can articulate their requirements, and the sector can feed up. So I think just very briefly, if I may, Jim, just before I finish, just because I think it might be useful context for other contributions later on. So within UKRI, we are shortly going to be launching a new environmental sustainability strategy. There is a focus on two key areas. None of this will surprise anyone, but the first is our own operations, and clearly we've got a lot of work to do within our own operations. And it's worthwhile noting that, of course, UKRI is a direct funder of its own research. You know, we do deliver our own research through our own institutions and centres. And a lot of those investments have significant carbon emissions associated with them, not least things like the SDFC accelerators and Diamond Light Source, NERC ships and planes, et cetera, et cetera. So we have a big job to do around our own operations. But the second thing most relevant to this conversation is around how we look at our funding service, what we do with our T's and C's going forwards, how we shape our calls to much better embed sustainability and climate change issues into that. I think if we get that right, that can help support coordination in this area going forward. And I'll pause there.
Okay, thank you very much, Rob. Vanessa.
Hello, hi. So I think when we're thinking about reviewing the scope of research which is underway in institutions and whether or not we can coordinate that better, I think what we first need to do is establish a clearer picture of the status quo, both in terms of what research has already been done and then what research is currently in train. So I think one of the solutions to that that we've discussed at the Rust Group level is a mapping exercise in order to sort of capture the full extent of research that's taking place across institutions. And members are currently considering how that might be best approached. So there's a number of considerations which need to be thought about when considering how to undertake that mapping exercise. I think the first is just to draw on some of the points that Alyssa and Rob already made, is kind of how climate research is actually classified, because there's a lot of research currently underway with a very specific aim of trying to identify, either issues or solutions to the climate challenges. But then there's a lot of other research that's underway which does not necessarily have that as a specific aim, but as an unintended positive outcome has been perhaps uncovering different challenges and solutions. So we need to think about how to capture that. I think also there's a question of how do we actually count the climate research as well. So is it in respect of the funding that's being directed towards different projects? I know some mapping exercises look at the citations, and also we need to look at how that's kind of directly impacted on the ground, whether it might be different government responses or the practices of businesses and wider stakeholders. I think that would be a really useful exercise to undertake. But when we've been liaising with members on this, I think what has become clear is that there's not necessarily a perfect solution to this. It's not quite clear that there is sort of one approach which will fit every institution. It will probably vary quite significantly depending on the size, maybe each institution, how many disciplines they cover, and sort of the interdisciplinarity element of it as well. And so lots of different considerations to think about when we consider how to enhance the coordination of climate research across institutions and also within institutions.
Thank you, Vanessa. And now Emma.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for the opportunity and for the first kind of three speakers. I probably come at this from a slightly different perspective from most of you on the call, coming from the kind of professions end rather than the kind of pure university end. So some of my answers may differ. That may be a good thing or not. Mm-hmm. So indeed, yes, I think coordination can always be improved. I'm always very wary about one kind of group coordinating for everybody else, because just by the nature of that, you make bottlenecks and kind of issues. What I would really love to see more, though, is a collective vision and a collective set of objectives and targets that people are all able to work towards, and a collective set of values. So regardless of where the research is being done, if it's being done under a collective vision, values, framework, then that will kind of by its nature help that coordination as well. So I think something around that would be really useful. And the other thing I wanted to add on top of the other speakers is we've talked a lot about the positive climate research, and I completely agree that is very, very broad. But what about the research that goes on that potentially has a negative climate impact? There's still a lot of research funded into kind of carbon-based technologies and all of those. So what is our kind of framework for addressing the negative carbon climate research as well as the positive? Of course, we want everything to be positive, but we live in the real world and it isn't. So addressing that impact, again, against a kind of a collective vision or framework, I think would be something that would be really valuable. That's all. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much, colleagues, for those first observations. I'm just going to call Ian and Marta in turn to see whether there are any observations they want to add to that or further supplementary questions.
Okay, you said my name first, I'll go first. Really interesting speakers, particularly what Emma was saying there at the end on the scope for a collective vision, collective values, and also then addressing what is our position on the research that's currently going on that's actually detrimental to the climate. So really interesting one. I'm going to respect somebody who's in the Commission and has asked a question. The question is, as a sector, we have mapped have we mapped the research happening in different institutions, partly to prevent duplication, partly to facilitate possible coordination. So there's a simple question from Alex Bowles of Guild HE. Jim, you look like Blofeld there. Stop stroking that cat. Maybe if one of the speakers could maybe just speak to that. Has there been an attempt to at least map, and we're aware of this dance between coordination and competition, but do we know what's happening? And could that be an area for the Commission to explore?
Who would like to respond? Rob, are you?
Just from a UKRI perspective on that point. So the individual research councils, I'm sure many people on the call will know this, but the individual research councils are continually doing various forms of mapping of their own and other constituent parts of UKRI, but also other funding body investments, not least to identify where there are particular kind of strengths in terms of UK, the research base in the UK, but also identify gaps. I think there's still more to be done within UKRI around the degree to which even that activity is coordinated within and across UK research innovation across the research councils. So that's one thing. The second thing is the extent to which the results of that mapping activity is shared externally in a format that could be of use to other bodies, not least the universities and colleges. So that's the kind of second point. Third point is in terms of how we're using some of the ways in which we're using that mapping activity in terms of the sort of gap analysis. Certainly within NERC, we're just coming to the end of another exercise whereby we're looking at our delivery plan that all the councils published delivery plans last year that set out long and short term objectives in terms of the areas they wanted to concentrate on in terms of funding. And even within that, we've identified gaps where our ambition in terms of funding has not been matched by the actual funding we've been doing, and so there we're undertaking some work, as are a lot of the other councils, to look at refreshing delivery plans to focus on that. I think the question then is to what extent all that discrete activity can be sort of bundled up and looked at top down to say, okay, what is the totality of this effort in relation to research that can deliver a positive climate outcome? Or indeed, as has been mentioned, to what extent is that balance between environmentally friendly, if I can put it that way, research and research that's in industries and technologies that has a more detrimental impact? So yeah, there's just some points for me there.
Thank you for that. I mean, clearly a number of challenges still in getting an accurate map of effort and outcome. Marta, was there anything you wish to say at this point?
Yeah, I think I have a small question, if it's possible. So I think it was really interesting. All that has been said, and in my role of student representative, I think what it came out, especially within the research that we had done here at the University of Sheffield within a group of PhD research regarding this coordination, that we have noticed that in a sense, if university research would be more the research within university would be more integrated into the corporate and professional service practices. Actually, this would make benefits for both university but also the corporate, because I'm sure all of you are aware that there's a lot of positive and positive example how this can create a mutual benefit, and actually you can get a more practical and powerful response to many of the challenges that we have. So I think the question would be whether this can be put in consideration within this point, and if it's possible.
Yeah, I think I'm going to ask our speakers if they could reflect upon that in responses as we go through our next set of questions. So if I move on to our second question, which was, what more can UK universities and colleges do to have a coordinated voice and impact on policy and to drive the knowledge exchange agenda? And if colleagues take you in the same order again, Alyssa, would you mind kicking off again?
Okay, sure. And I guess my answer will partly pick up on some of that question you just asked, Marta, I guess. And sorry for the others who are answering that. If I'm going first again, if I steal what you were going to say. I think that a coordinated voice on policy and impact has great potential. In fact, I feel more comfortable with that in a way than more coordinated research, which I think has a risk of becoming normative. Whereas I think a coordinated voice on policy and impact has great potential. And I would agree with Marta that a lot of the potential there lies at the university level, working quite closely with professional services individuals. And I guess I would say that because I'm one of those people. And I think the coordination is also important because there's a limited capacity of those key people that we want to influence. So the key policymakers and the people in business, they don't have the capacity to hear and unpick the messages coming from lots of different voices at the same time. The same is true of the public. So I think some better coordination there, it could be valuable. We just have to make sure that sometimes if you try to create too coordinated a message, you lose the nuance. You end up with something that's kind of a bit like, it gets less punch. It's maybe hard to develop an agreed and detailed message. So there is a challenge there, but I think we could be doing more. The degree of influence I find often depends on established relationships of all kinds of sorts of relationships. And that's where we can see also the role of the professional services, people in universities, but also collective groups. So I wanted to highlight the work of the university's policy network, UPenn, which works across topic areas and is bringing together people from different universities to help feed into government policy making. And I think that's a really good route. Also, I mentioned before the learned societies, also really powerful. And I've been, one of the things I've been bringing together is a universities working on COP26 group, which I mentioned last time on the call. And already I've seen some kind of added benefit. So I thought, oh, these people, these researchers who are many in the same area of climate research, all know each other. And I therefore assumed they know what each other are doing on this type of thing, policy and impact, but actually that's not true. So I've already seen a great benefit of just bringing those people onto a call every 4 to 6 weeks and thinking about shared and common goals. Even if we don't do things together, it enables us to have some kind of common messaging that we can each use in our own kind of way. And that then sort of, as I said, there's a limited capacity of the people listening to us to listen to all of us at the same time. So other partners that can be useful there are people in industry. The all-party parliamentary groups are mentioned in this note, and they've all got value in those discussions.
Okay. Thank you, Alyssa. Rob?
Yeah, thanks, Jim. I think other experts can talk more authoritatively around what's currently happening and how that can be improved. So I'll kind of restrict myself to a couple of observations, really, probably more related to my background. I'm relatively new to UKRI. I've been about 2 years, but prior to that, spent 10 years in private sector consulting. And one observation I would just make is that we should, I think it's worth considering to what extent that kind of coordination of voice and consensus across universities and colleges, by what method can the messages of that coordination be delivered to the people that need to hear them? And there are a number of ways of doing that, not least thinking about how we can interface with NGOs, some of the big sort of consulting firms that speaking from personal experience, quite often are commissioned by corporates to translate academic research, to do that kind of grey literature job, that sort of secondary research, and try and consolidate consensus from the literature. So I would just make the point that we need to think about coordination across university colleges, but also then talk about the way that we get those messages out. And then another aspect in terms of that is in terms of, I guess, not not just engagement with policymakers and engagement with business, but engagement with the public at large as well. I think in terms of really driving impact, I've in the last couple of years particularly been very heavily involved in UK RI's work on the sort of plastics issue. And my reflection on that is that, you know, there's been decades of really, really good research on plastic impact in the environment. You know, it took public engagement through a number of mechanisms, not least Blue Planet, but others as well. It took public engagement to really drive the issue up the agenda, and very quickly, in the space of 12 months, policymakers, corporates, NGOs, the public at large, kind of all sort of coalesced and have been pulling the research from the research base much stronger than they had before, and that's been able to be done in a much more coordinated way as well. So I guess my question is, how do we sort of start replicating some of that in terms of what we want to do in the broader climate area?
Thank you very much, Rob. Vanessa.
Just to echo a number of the points that have already been made by Alyssa and Rob, I think you know, a key part of, you know, coordinating our voice and having an impact both in terms of policy and driving knowledge exchange is kind of how we disseminate the findings of the research that have already been undertaken. So how we sort of translate those breakthroughs and discoveries into real world solutions for whether it's, you know, the government in terms of how they deliver against their policy objectives, or businesses in terms of how they improve their practices. So I think it's kind of ensuring a joined up approach between kind of academics on the ground who are actually doing research, and then perhaps sort of connecting them with the comms teams across universities, both internally and also across the sector. And then, as Alyssa said, kind of building on the partnerships that we've already got with key decision makers. So making sure that we have those channels open, and we're able to communicate those messages effectively. I think we talked about kind of coordination across the sector and in institutions, and we've got our environmental sustainability network, which from our experience so far has been really, really effective in kind of sharing best practice, helping universities to identify sort of common challenges and risks and opportunities coming down the track. So that's been a really, really effective way to kind of coordinate our messages internally, and I'm sure it would be really great to kind of continue that work and also work more across the sector as well.
Thank you, Vanessa. And Emma.
Thank you. So again, agree with much of what's been said already. I think at the moment we're seeing a bit of a masterclass on the news where the science is being allowed to speak, and then it's being explained to people in a very clear and coherent way that they can understand. And I think as a country, we're not always very good at doing that. So letting the science speak, but translating it into a way that people can understand and can take action from, I think is really important. One of the most common messages I hear from lots of businesses, they want to take climate action, they don't know what to do. Even those that you think would know what to do, don't know what to do, and they get bamboozled by this piece of information or that piece of information. So the more we can kind of let the science speak, use the evidence, use our experts, trust our experts, but explain it in a really clear and coherent way for people, the better. The only other thing I was going to say is that we coordinate 24 professional bodies to work together on policy. It's tricky. It takes a lot of trust, and I completely agree with what Alyssa said about relationships. And again, with that, it's about having that kind of clear vision, joined up, but letting the experts lead and having trust in the people who really know what they're talking about, that others will challenge them, critically kind of evaluate, and then kind of fall in behind that evidence and those experts as well. That's all from me.
Okay, thank you very much. Again, some very insightful observations from our evidence providers. Ian or Marta, anything specific, or are you happy for us to carry on with the questions? Conscious that we've got to be aware of the time that we've set aside, and I want to have the opportunity for everyone who's patiently listening to get their comments and observations in as well. So I think, unless there's any burning point from either of you, Pausing.
Okay.
Marta?
It's okay to move on.
Okay, we'll move on. We're going to bring Joanna in on this one. Vanessa's going to keep muted, I think. So would you be happy, colleagues, if I now switch the order and start with Emma? Just a little bit of variety, give Emma the opportunity to kick off.
I think that's only fair.
Yeah, let's try and be fair, eh? So this is about the sustainability of the environmental sustainability of the wider research effort in the universities and colleges. Is there more that could be done to drive and incentivize behaviors through regulation and policy, such as the grant application processes, the conditions that are set for grants? What are your views? What might make a difference in enhancing the environmental sustainability, particularly in that broad definition of climate that we're working with as the Commission?
Okay,
So,
you caught me up then by going backwards.
Sorry.
Good to make sure I stay awake. Of course, there is always more that can be done. I'm not going to comment on what universities are currently doing because I don't have enough experience of that it would be very kind of anecdotal, and I don't think that's fair. But of course there is always more that can be done. Money, of course, always talks. I get concerned with setting lots of things in regulation unless they're going to be policed in some way, because otherwise they become meaningless unless there's a way of demonstrating that. I think the work that's been done in kind of environmental policy, where we look at kind of regulations and is it kind of carrot or stick, I think there may be some lessons that we can take from some of that into kind of rewarding the good behaviours rather than just punishing the bad behaviours. And there's some really interesting work that's come out of the Environment Bill around objective and target setting as well. And I wonder if there's something that we can learn from some of that work on setting some short, medium and long-term objectives that everybody is signing up to in some way. But just to kind of summarise, yes, of course, we can always do more. Let's be wary of too much kind of penalty that we don't then enforce, and really look at ways that we can reward the behaviours that we want to see and encourage them that way as well.
Thank you, Emma. Joanna, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks. So if I've understood the question correctly, I think this is about all research in all disciplines across the university being done in a manner that is environmentally sustainable. And I think it's a really important question and a good an important thing that sort of universities and the various funders that they work with to think about together and working on that collaboratively. In terms of specifically what could be done, I think we would be a bit wary of adding in new things like new terms and conditions to grant applications. I think conditions on their own are a bit of a blunt instrument to get things done. I think much more helpful would be sort of ways in working together to encourage this sort of positive culture of conducting research in more sustainably, environmentally sustainable manner. Of course, as you all know, some research projects are funded by multiple funders, and so there'd need to be coordination and sort of flexibility really for things to be interpreted so that there isn't conflicting guidance and interests between different funders. So really working, the researchers and the funders working together to identify what the helpful instruments will be towards that. Of course, you know, universities in a lot of cases are already have their own institutional approaches to doing their operations in environmentally sustainable ways, whether that's around travel or efficiencies that can be made around energy, that sort of thing. So ways that we can recognise and encourage things that are already taking place, and developing how that can be enhanced alongside the funders working in partnership. I think it's really important. One final thing to mention is the cost implications of any new conditions or criteria that would be could be introduced. Would need to make sure that those would be fully covered as well.
Okay, and an excellent link into Rob, I suspect. And you've already mentioned the environmental sustainability work that you're doing, Rob. Maybe this is the ideal time to expand on that.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. Just to, I guess, respond off the back of Joanna's comments there. I think I'm in complete agreement around making sure that we get the balance right in terms of demands that are made through grant T's and C's and the need for sort of flexibility. I think that's kind of an important principle. I think I'd also be supportive of, you know, your comments around the how we, rather than sort of just stringent T's and C's that people have to kind of sort of methodically tick off against or just consider, how do we instill more more consciousness of the sustainability issues around research through other means. UKRI is doing quite a lot of work at the moment in terms of research culture. Broadly, it covers a lot of areas, but I think we need to we need to find ways to include environmental sustainability within that and not treat it as something completely separate. Sometimes our structures in UKRI don't help that, but it's something we're trying to work on. We are, as part of, some people on the call will no doubt know, UKRI is doing a lot of work at the moment to rationalise and sort of consolidate the various historical funding systems, T's and C's, etc., across the different councils. As part of our single funding service programme. We are doing work within that to look at how we can include more consideration of environmental sustainability in applications. But I do think even thinking about the way that calls are structured and the way that calls are explained, the objectives of calls can give some very powerful signals to PIs and co-Is around just thinking about these issues and evidencing what they're proposing to do. Just by illustration, again related to the work I've been doing in terms of some of our plastics programs. Innovate UK, so the business funding arm of UKRI, we've been running a series of calls recently around plastics and feasibility studies and demonstrators around plastic packaging, and we've worked quite hard to introduce two new specific questions into the application process around life cycle analysis and effectively net positive environmental impact of the proposals, and just the sheer fact of having those two simple questions in there is a really powerful lever to get people to think about those things in their applications, almost regardless of what the subject matter is. So I think that's something we're keen to do some more work on. And then just a final point, if I may, I'm conscious I've been going for quite a while. I'm one of the things in our strategy that we're trying to do is really get a grip on embedding environmental sustainability considerations in decisions across the organisation. And I'm sure that universities are thinking along those lines as well. And certainly within UKRI, we're really keen to understand what universities and colleges are doing around that sort of normalisation of environmental sustainability considerations in all sorts of decision making, not just on the research, but what universities are doing in terms of their estate, how they're interacting with their students. And I think that's another area where we can all learn a lot from each other. So I'll stop there.
Okay, thanks for that, Rob. I think there's a conversation that you might have with EAUC offline about picking up on those issues. I'm sure Ian would want to pick that up later. Alyssa, we'll come to you to wrap this particular question up.
Okay, great. I don't think there's much more to add. I mean, after the things that everyone else said, just a few thoughts from my side. Of course, like I think it was Emma who said, of course, this relates to every kind of area of research in the university, and the environmental impact of research can be really, really varied across the type of research. There are some really interesting individual initiatives. So one of the things we're involved in is LEAF, which is at the lab level, so trying to get labs to be more environmentally friendly, as well as, of course, overall behavior of academics, like flight and so on. So I think, really sharing approaches between universities, which I know you guys do at EAUC quite a lot, is really, really helpful to making success there. I would say maybe not to challenge, but I think the idea of working together to find kind of shared positive and sort of almost voluntary approaches is really good, but I actually think it won't be enough. And I do think that we should think about that it's very powerful to have specifications in research funders documentation, which is kind of what you were talking about, Rob. And the example, and of course, I mean, if it's a tick box exercise, it's not helpful, and it can also lead to perverse outcomes. So this idea of working together, I really liked the idea of working together to identify what instruments work. But this example of what the Wellcome Trust just recently specifying that anyone who gets money from them will have to either get offsets. Well, there's a whole series of things that they need to do in relation to their flight, is a real start. It's the first time I think we've seen a funder put these kind of climate change related specifications into their research funding requirements. And that's really, really interesting, because I think that's quite like what we saw before with tobacco. The Wellcome Trust has that kind of provision, and it's actually very powerful. So I think that this is an urgent and important issue, and I think we do need to see more than just voluntary approaches. But of course, it's tricky because lots of different types of research, some of which have some quite stringent demands. But I just wanted to finish with what makes the university sector kind of unique that helps in this regard. I first of all think that if universities can't get this right, then who can? I mean, we've got loads of people who understand the issue. We've got the potential to bring together lots of different disciplines. And if we hide behind an argument that it's hard for this person and hard for that person, then I don't think we can really expect anyone else to be able to solve it. And the second thing I'd say is that this idea of the costs, often people think it's more expensive to do things in an environmentally friendly way. Sometimes it is, but sometimes it isn't. Sometimes the challenge really is that the costs are upfront. Or they're spread in a different way in terms of cash flow. Universities are unique in that many universities are actually in it for a really, really long term, right? Universities have their assets for a long time and are able to plan in a very different way than many other actors. So I think that's something that can be seized upon when planning research in a more environmentally friendly way.
Okay, some really helpful observations again from our four evidence providers. I'll just check again with, Rob, are you signaling to make an additional comment?
Yeah, just a quick final comment, just picking up on what Alyssa said there. I'd be really interested to know if anyone's aware of any research that might either is starting now or might start around reflecting on the impact of the current situation in terms of research and the enforced restrictions and what the creative ways that different people doing different types of research are getting around the restriction, particularly with regard to travel and impacts, and how that might be built into the system in the future, so that we're doing more of that and we don't rebound straight back to the previous way of doing things.
Could I ask colleagues who might have observations to use the Zoom group chat to put their ideas there, and then Ian and Fiona will try and sweep those back up into the conversation in the second half of the proceedings. If we move on to the last question, and I'll take them in the order that I did the last one, so I'll start with you again, Emma. It's about our international links and the collaborations, the huge importance that international research collaboration, of course, has. But are we getting the most out of it? Are we maximizing the global impact opportunities of the research that's right across this spectrum of activities that we're calling climate research in this emergency situation? Are we getting the maximum outcome here, Emma?
Okay, well, there's an easy answer to this one. No, of course we're not. We can always do more. I think there's some really good examples of international collaboration. Clearly, COP this year, fingers crossed, provides a massive opportunity for us to do that. And what I would really love to see, kind of spans over all the answers, is a lot more work around the kind of the what works type philosophy. As I said, people out in the field, practitioners, they want to know, want what to do, they want advice. There's a lot of kind of counter messaging out there. Well, if you do one thing, it has an impact on something else. People are looking for really clear guidance led by science and evidence on what measures that they should be taking. So the more we can get the research and those international collaborations around what works, both the kind of short, medium and long term, the better for me.
Okay, thank you. Joanna?
Yeah, I'd agree with Emma. There's definitely potential to do a lot more with the international links. There's already a lot of international research collaboration taking place, and some of the the world's best research is done internationally, and we're in a new political climate post Brexit. Put Corona aside for the moment, and there's definitely a lot of opportunity going forward in doing even more international research collaboration. I think it would be wise for UK to take advantage of some of the international research frameworks which already exist. So that I'm thinking about Horizon Europe, which has a specific mission around climate change. We were talking earlier as well about sort of shared values and shared sort of vision for working through that. And I think international collaboration offers opportunities there as well. But beyond Europe as well, the other nations around the world, I think there's opportunity in that space as well. So with the political context that we're in and the government making its own net zero commitments, I think we can use this as an opportunity to put that forward as a sort of a key priority to push for more international collaboration on climate research.
Thank you. Rob?
Yeah, thank you. On the international side, I'd agree with sort of panelists so far. I looked it up quickly before coming online. So UKRI spent over 300 million on overseas development assistance programs last year. I think it's going to be around the same this year. There's a question to the extent to which we've got opportunities to apply that in a way that has that considers environmental sustainability a little bit more in the cross research areas. I think that's definitely the case, and we need to do that. And as Joanna said, there's a lot of international collaboration work that goes on just within NERC. We're very heavily involved in the Belmont Forum. There are other similar bodies, and I think it's just a fertile space. There is more we can do there, and I suspect that the kind of the way of doing that, the kind of the hook, is linking through obviously into the SDGs and how we link in what we're talking about here with the SDGs, and in make sure that with our international partners we're making those links really explicit, and lining up how delivering those programs in that way links into those kind of climate related SDGs, because I think that's an important way of doing it.
Okay, thank you, Rob. And Alyssa?
Okay, just unmuting. Yeah, okay, so I think that we shouldn't underestimate the amount of things that we're already doing internationally. Yes, there's of course really always more opportunity to do more internationally. I wanted to pick up on this bit at the end, which of the question, which says, are we getting the most of our international links to have maximum global impact? So I think thinking about what that looks like, what are we aiming for in terms of global impact is really important. I think we have to be really conscious of the different kinds of styles of impact. So, having some kind of sometimes north-south collaborations is a very different story than collaborating with other countries that have similar levels of economic development to us. And also different kinds of politics can influence what is taken well in terms of having global impact with our research in this area. So I think we need to be really sensitive to that, and that might influence the ways in which leveraging global impact makes sense. I would say that we should first think about what already goes really well. So obviously there are lots of global platforms for having this kind of impact. There's the IPCC, obviously, and IPBES, which take already the scientific knowledge and take it to a policy forum. Quite well respected, very impactful, and a huge amount of UK research is involved there, both researchers and sources of research. And I think that's, feeding into those, recognizing where these existing platforms are powerful is really important. I think also, again, we spoke before about relationships, but we know that relationships with some of the UK government bodies can help here. So being closely connected to the government's science team in the Bayes department is helpful. They're currently thinking about promoting certain areas of UK science internationally for impact in the light of COP26, but that's also a role that they might play more regularly. And the Foreign Office's Science and Innovation Network is also really good at doing that. So I think, those relationships are quite valuable. Maybe we need to think about how, as a community, we make the most of those kind of opportunities. And then, of course, there's a lot that happens subject by subject wise, where people have their own international research collaborations. So an example, for example, is sustainable water management, where I know a lot of people who work on that, and then therefore are parts of these other groupings run by people like the British Council and so on, who share knowledge. So again, I think it speaks to these relationships with these other groups that can play a really powerful role in delivering that material internationally, and as I said before, in a politically sensitive manner.
Okay, thank you very much indeed to our 5 evidence providers. We've come to the end of the formal presentation of evidence. Again, thank you, each of you. Ian, I'm going to pass back to you with the support of Marta to widen the conversation, and I'll come back towards the end.
Thank you, Jim, and thank you, speakers, really good. And Marta, please do just jump in. And Manveer, another student commissioner, also on the call. Do please, we need to hear that student voice. And anyone, this is your time now to build, hopefully, on the 4 questions, those sort of areas that the Commission have agreed to try to focus on. Are they the right questions? And is there any sense of cohesion, clarity, coming out? So please just jump in, ideally with your sound and video, or just use the chat box. And while you're thinking, I'm going to pick up on question number 2, and I'll let anyone jump in, but obviously panel, please do. It's on the linkage between science, climate science, and policy. How close or direct is the link, and how close direct do we want it to be, and is there a clear one, and if not, what could be done? So any of the panel want to jump in on that one?
I mean, I think if we want to talk about the links between climate science and policy in the UK, I think actually we've got quite good links. We have a really big team, not big, but I would say it's not insubstantial. There's a team in the Department of Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy that is a climate science team. And that team is responsible for making sure that the science is well understood in the rest of the civil service. And they really work on the strict climate science side of things, not necessarily the whole breadth that we spoke about earlier. I would say that in our dealings as the Grantham Institute at Imperial, we publish a lot of briefing papers across a whole load of issues to do with climate change. And that's actually really well received by a lot of people in the civil service. They're really interested in understanding the science around a whole lot of issues and making sure that they're taking it into their information, into their policy making work. And we're often invited, as I know are others, to do lunchtime presentations in the civil service and help that build into their work. I would say also another route for getting good science into evidence making is through the parliamentary consultation processes, as well as individual consultations, such as we've seen on the Environment Bill recently. And there's quite a few actually that have been out in on the environmental space, including climate. Net zero was another example where there was great evidence fed in. And another area where we have good evidence provision to policymaking, again in the UK, is the Climate Change Committee, which is pretty robust in terms of an independent advisory committee. I think it works better. I would say it's one of the best of those kind of organizations. They're quite heavily supported also by other academic input going into them. So it's not that they're beyond critique, but I think that all those different structures we have in place are quite good for getting climate science into policymaking. I think what we have to remember, of course, is the policy decisions that are made on balance, which takes the science and combines it with political prerogative. And that's where, there may be sometimes frustration on the part of the people presenting the science, because the link from science to solution, on that journey, the scientists might have a different answer than the policymakers, and indeed than the politicians. And sorry, that was all about UK. I mean, there could be a broader and different answer for international, but I'll stop there.
I'm just going to add that, yeah, I agree with all of that. I think that we've seen around the climate and the environment bill and other areas that civil servants are certainly doing that. I think the political dial, if you want to call it that, has certainly swung in recent times to be listening to the science more based on public pressure, voter pressure, might we say. So I think the ears have pricked up a little more in terms of some of that science based on the kind of public pressure that we've seen around climate change as well.
Thank you, Emma. Yeah, I agree with you entirely. So I think there's an opportunity here, and the Commissioned job is to ask us all, are we suitably positioned and coherent and coordinated to have the impact? So if you do have thoughts, in the next week or so, do please contribute on what the Commission can advise or what would be useful for us to do to support ensuring that voice is heard. I'm going to ask, a couple of people are asking questions here. So Alex Bowles, Deputy CEO of Guild HC, are you able to unmute yourself and ask your question regarding Green Athena Swan?
I was being a little bit mischievous about trying to shift back to some of the sort of the practical kind of things that we as a commission could be pulling together in terms of some kind of recommendations or outputs as we sort of near the end of the process. And so is there sort of something practical that we could be suggesting? And so I highlighted a couple, including something like sort of a Green Athena Swan. So clearly Athena Swan has been fantastically successful at raising the profile of getting particularly women into science and STEM subjects more generally, but has now been used at looking at women progression throughout the higher education sector. So is there some kind of similar accreditation or something like that which could be used to, I suppose, build on Rob's point about the research culture or the environmental sustainability culture within the institution that will have enough backing behind it for it to be taken seriously? And so I think what worked about Athena Swan, or made it work, was when it was suddenly linked to various research funding incomes. So is there something like that, or a section on research application forms that encourages institute applicants to consider the environmental impact of it? Or what is there that we could be considering that would help accelerate this process, particularly on the research side?
Is there anyone, thank you very much, Alex. Is there anyone in the wider group who'd like to respond to that? Please do. Would such a thing be useful? Panel, anyone there would like to raise? Do you think that has potential?
Yeah, I think it's definitely something worth discussing. I think depending on how exactly it functioned, it could be something that universities would welcome. I know that there is definitely that willingness in the universities to be doing more in this area, and perhaps some sort of structured things like that could be helpful. I think they would have to be developed in consultation with those that it would impact most immediately. But I think it's a really interesting idea.
Can I flip the question on its head? Thank you, Joanna. Is there appetite or need to look at current T's and C's of funding that actually has a detrimental climate price. So, for example, we design in to our funding often the need to travel. And often international travel. Now, I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I'm just, we're now being forced to think about this and consider good travel options. So while we can focus on the costs and the effort of additional criteria, what's the scope to look at current criteria in terms of its climate price? Anyone from the panel?
Yeah, hi. Yeah, certainly within the work doing UKRI, that question has definitely come up, and we're really keen to do some work on that in terms of, I think it's just as you described it. Actually, it's kind of thinking through each of the existing T's and C's and saying what behaviour is that driving, either implicitly or explicitly. Travel is a big area, but it'd be the wider research culture, I guess, in terms of how researchers are rewarded in terms of their research, and what that, by implication, what does that mean in terms of travel and conferences and things like that. So that's definitely a really key area that we're keen to explore, and possibly opportunity to plug the fact that we're in discussion, date changes notwithstanding, to hopefully have the opportunity to run a bit of a workshop on this at the EAUC Gene conference, to get some more contributions from the wider community on that point, actually. So I think it's a good one, and one we're keen to explore more.
Okay, thank you. Next question is from one of the student commissioners. So Manveer Gill from Warwick University, if you could come in next. And then if I could after that go to Alison Green for your question, Alison, if you're able to go on video. Okay, Manveer.
So, hi everyone. I was thinking about Emma's point about the value of setting targets in order to drive action. And so, in what ways could climate-related targets begin to be implemented in this context of research and research grants, if that's even possible? Because maybe that's more of an institution-wide type of objective. Could there be scope to work with the Science-Based Targets Initiative? And I guess this is a broader question about how we measure progress in terms of making sure that we're going in the right direction and at the kind of pace that we'd like to.
Thank you, Manveer. Okay, anyone want to respond, please?
I'll just add one thing on that. I'm a great fan of targets and breaking them down. So we know when we're trying to hit net zero by, okay, so what does that mean for next year, or 5 years down the track, or 10 years down the track? I'd love to see some kind of roadmap for all sectors, actually, to achieve net zero, and how does that impact on the decisions that we take today and tomorrow and next week in terms of actually getting there. Just having this big target kind of 30 years down the track doesn't help any of us. So the more we can kind of detail that roadmap and then help that inform our decisions, the better for me.
Thank you, Emma. Anyone else?
Just if I can come in on that, Ian. I think in terms of sort of what we were discussing just before around T's and C's and funding conditions, I think that's difficult in terms of targets, because I think, particularly in terms of sort of setting targets or requiring research to hit or contribute to certain targets is very difficult, because the research is all different. There's a question about to what target you use and how you respond to that. I think there's a question as to how can universities and colleges use targets internally, and then how might their commitments to those targets be reflected in applications that give some assurance to the funders that institution, and therefore by default the research that institution is doing, is lined up with those targets. I think that's probably the kind of way to go. And then the final point I make is, saying that the difficult, particularly in this sector, of setting the targets is, I'm aware of research where, that's there are certainly some people out there in the research space that are, critical of some of the more established targets and methodologies, and research is moving all the time. So there is a slight difficulty in you know, nailing your colours to the mast in terms of some of those targets where, you know, the research is moving so quickly, and those targets may prove to be, you know, founded on science that has moved on. So that's a difficult issue as well. I'm not quite sure how, as I sit here today, how we resolve that issue.
Okay, thank you very much.
If I could just come in on that quickly as well, it's just important also to recognise that lots of universities have set targets, but they're all slightly different, both in terms of sort of the baseline performance and also in terms of sort of their targets, in terms of the scopes, whether it's 1, 2 or 3, and sort of their ambitions in that area. So I think it's quite important to recognise the diversity that exists across the sector, depending on sort of what your state of play is. And then also you'll probably find that some research projects have, you know, particular impacts and particular poor performances depending on the metrics that you're looking at. So it's important to kind of recognise that it will vary quite significantly across different institutions depending on the type of research that's undertaken.
Great, thank you. Thank you. I'm going to move on. Alison Green, are you able to verbally ask your question? And then if you are, maybe Marta, one of the student commissioners, can add her supplementary question before the panel respond. Alison?
Sure, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I've been taking copious notes as people have been speaking, and I'd like to submit them at the end of the session. I think I'd actually like to focus on the second point I've made, and that is the controversial point that I believe it's still the case that UKRI is still supporting and funding research in, for example, fracking. So I had a conversation with Ian Stanton some months ago and he confirmed this. And it seems to me to be hypocritical for universities on the one hand to be taking a stand on the climate emergency, whilst at the same time willingly receiving funding from fossil fuel companies and from UKRI for research that effectively makes the problem worse. You know, and I really feel that if we cannot at this point in time collectively as higher education, as further education, if we cannot come together and actually take a stand, a moral stand around this, and proactively make a point of ceasing research that is geared towards enhancing the profits of, for example, fossil fuel companies, Shell, BP, and so on. And I note that just on the first point I've made, just want to comment on a piece that I've just read today from Anthony Selden, and he's talking about the fact that universities need to cohere more in order that they become more powerful lobbyists and have a more powerful voice. And of course, I wholeheartedly endorse that point. And I think it speaks to the comment that has been made, I think, by two people separately, which is that it's taken public pressure, not academic pressure, it's taken public pressure to actually shift things along, for example, in the relation to plastics. Does that not speak to a significant failing on the part of UK higher education, further education?
Alison, excellent, thank you. Marta, would you just like to add your question?
Yeah, I think from students' perspective, I think this point is also really relevant because I don't know, within most of the university you have this career fair and there's a lot of funding within research by different companies, and most of the time or sometimes these companies are actually less ethical or sustainable than others, and we have to think that these are actually sometimes links that student and researcher have with company, and they might find a job over there. So we also think that it's really important to think about this point of the university engaging and with more sustainable, environmental sustainable and ethical companies.
Great, thank you, Alison and Marta. So panel, would you like to come back to that? We're short on time, so brief answers, please.
Ian, if I may, just the point, I guess, which reflects the sort of the challenge in terms of the UKRI investments. I think this. What I would say is this is potentially where the universities and colleges have, I guess, a little more independence than UKRI does to you know, make decisions about where and how they work. I think or probably say on that at the moment is that, you know, UKRI, unlike some other independent funders of research, you know, its money comes direct through from Bayes, and although UKRI has, you know, independence in terms of where it directs the majority of that money, not all, but the majority of that money, I think we, you know, we have to reflect that's the situation we're in terms of the funding that we make and the decisions we make, particularly in terms of if we're deciding not to fund a particular activity or in a particular sector. That's something that, you know, we can't do, or very difficult for us to do unilaterally. So a bit of a politician's answer on that, I'm afraid, from me. But I think, again, if anything, I think I kind of reiterate, I think it's Alison's point around public pressure. You know, if public pressure drives, you know, the politics in the direction it seems to be, then I think we'll start seeing, you know, things happen in line with the sorts of things that Alison's advocating. But, you know, it's difficult for UKRI to make, as I say, unilateral decisions in that regard at the moment. So.
Okay. Emma?
I think it's a good point, well made. Brand is incredibly important, isn't it? And I am pretty sure that lots of students are looking at universities and their portfolios in terms of looking where they apply. I've been really honoured the last couple of years to be a judge on the, let me get this right, or Ian will tell me off, the Sustainability Organisation of the Year through the Green Gown Awards, and seen some really great examples of what some universities are doing, both in terms of their research and their students, in their investments and their portfolios. And I think there's some great lessons there that others can be learning from that as well. But yeah, good point, well made.
Anyone else on the panel want to quickly come back to the question, the challenge?
Yeah, I just might make a couple of comments. Yeah, one of this example of the student pressure, I think, is really like live. I mean, I see it I do see it happening. We have some students on our campus who are doing master's programs in things to do with oil and gas extraction, and they actively have asked us, because we're an institute on campus working on climate change, what we can do to help them find career paths that help tackle climate change rather than cause it. And I think that's quite an extreme example. I think people who are already doing courses that are so specific. So I think that pressure is important. But one of the things I hear come up a lot when I have discussions on this topic is a sort of almost philosophical question, but what's the role of a university? And I think that if universities really do say, oh, it's all about public pressure, I think that's shirking the responsibility of university. Universities should be thought leaders. And I think we should be seeing some in the university community actually being the leader, leading the thinking on what needs to be done here. And I think we should all challenge ourselves to see that happen.
Thank you, Alyssa. Yeah, well, I think there's maybe work for the commission here. Jim, if it's okay, I'm going to go for one more question before handing back, if that's okay. And it's to Aled Williams. Aled, are you able to speak?
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
What a background.
Wow, what can I say? It's a question of distillation. Going to what Emma was saying, there's a lot of information out there, some of it quite complex, and clearly it needs to be distilled down. You know, if I'm drinking a bottle of wine, I don't need to drink the whole bottle of wine to know it's a decent bottle of wine. So is there a role there for EAUC to curate research in terms of what works and best practice, and draw that together in terms of messaging for key constituencies, particularly in the higher education sector?
The answer from the EAUC will be yes, but I'd be interested in other people's thoughts on, you know, the need for that, the value of that. Any quick comments on that? Or is it a given? Jim? Ooh, lost everybody.
No, just had to unmute there, sorry. Yes, of course, the EAUC, but I think it's another one of those collaborative endeavours. It's not the EAUC alone, but there's a role for the EAUC.
Absolutely. Thank you. Fiona, just checking, are there any questions that have been asked on the chat that we've not addressed in any shape or form?
Ian, I thought I saw Matt Dunlop waving his hand as though he had a question. Matt, was I interpreting that correctly?
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. I just wanted to comment on the conversation we were having about expanding from, a lot of universities have done work on divestment and responded to that student pressure. And I think my impression as a practitioner is that most are in the foothills of even beginning to consider their relationships more broadly with the fossil fuel industry across their organization, whether that's careers, research. There's an awful lot to be done on those aspects. I think we're all receiving freedom of information requests, I'm sure, requesting what have we had in terms of funding, because it does bring to bear a potential mismatch between public commitment around divestment, net zero targets, and our relationships elsewhere. And this is an issue that we need to tackle as a sector, and I think we can work together to try and tackle it. But teasing those relationships out, I think, is going to be a big challenge for us, and it's certainly something that we're starting to look at in our university, and I'm engaging with our executive board on, but I don't pretend to have all the answers yet, and I think there's quite a way to go on this. And just one other point that I wanted to reflect, anecdotally, I get the impression that PVCs for research are not universally on board with climate emergency being a pressure that's a priority for them, and that's something that perhaps we need to engage at that level. There are other headwinds in UK research that I understand are far higher up the priority list for our PVCs, and I think that's something that we need to address.
Okay, thank you, Matt. That's a very helpful observation that we as a set of climate commissioners need to take into the mix. How do we actually reach those who are instrumental within individual institutions about framing the research agenda of that institution? Colleagues, very conscious now we're nearly at the closure time, and I know many of you have other things to do. So can I take this opportunity to thank each and every one of our evidence providers, to thank each of you who have listened in for the last hour and a half, and those who have asked questions. We've been capturing all of this in both note form, and Fiona's been recording this, and this will become available online, as already you will be able to listen again to the first evidence session. We are in a process of working through 5 evidence sessions, and we have a further one on the 29th of April, followed by one on the 19th of May, and then our final one on the 2nd of June. You'll be able to book yourself onto all of those through the EAUC website. These are important steps in the work of the Climate Commission. Even with the current COVID emergency, we're working on the assumption that we will at least work our way through on our timescale to cohere all of the evidence into a set of observations to try and catalyse action across the combined sector. From what we've heard today about research, there have been important observations shared with us about the way in which research funding does or does not embrace climate emergency concerns and expectations within the manner in which research is offered to and is received by universities from UKRI and others. We have heard about the importance of the process or the operation of research activities being within the scope of our considerations. And of course, the outcomes of a very broad range of research and knowledge exchange. It's not just the atmospheric sciences, this goes all the way through the natural and social sciences and into the way in which KE is configured. And wrapped around that, we've heard a great deal about our interrelationship with civil society and the way in which we share that knowledge and the way in which the research and knowledge exchange translates quickly both into the way in which civil society operates, but also back up into the policy domain in government and other agencies. So a lot for us to reflect upon. We will put that into the mix with the evidence out of the suite of gathering sessions. and hopefully we will have some of you back online on the 29th of April. In the meantime, can I say thank you very much indeed to all of you, and do take care, stay healthy, and we will speak again. Thank you again, colleagues. Bye-bye. Ian.